There is a man alive today who has never seen a single sunrise, never seen the face of the woman who loved him first, never seen the color of autumn leaves, the shimmer of a stage light, or the tears running down the faces of a billion strangers while his music played. He has never seen anything. Not 1 second of the world. He spent 75 years illuminating for the rest of us. And yet, Stevie Wonder understood something about this life that most people who can see will never grasp. He understood that the darkest places are not where the light ends. They are where it begins. What you are about to hear is not a celebration. It is not a tribute reel. It is the truth about one of the most extraordinary lives ever lived, and the extraordinary cost of living it. The car accident that nearly killed him. The marriage that shattered the man beneath the music. The kidney failure he hid from the world. The mother's death that changed everything. The children he loved and could not always reach. And a final, devastating chapter that has left those closest to him speaking carefully and quietly, in the way people speak when something precious has been broken and they are not entirely sure it can be put back together. By the time this story is over, you will never hear his music the same way again, because the music was not made in spite of all of this. It was made from it. Every note, every word, every chord that ever reached inside you and touched something you could not name. It came from here, from exactly this. So stay with me, because what follows is the truth behind the legend. And the truth, as Stevie Wonder himself always knew, is the only thing worth singing about. Cleveland Hardaway Morris entered the world on May 13, 1950, in Saginaw, Michigan, 6 weeks too soon and fighting for every breath. The hospital placed him inside an incubator and flooded it with pure oxygen to keep him alive. That oxygen saved his life. It also destroyed the blood vessels behind both of his eyes, a condition called retinopathy of prematurity. By the time his mother, Lula Mae Hardaway, carried him home, her son was permanently, irreversibly blind. He would never see her face. He would never see sunlight on water or the expression on a stranger's face when his music made them cry. He was not yet 1 year old. Lula Mae was 21 years old, poor, and largely alone. His father, Calvin Judkins, drifted in and out of their lives, offering little warmth and even less stability. When Stevie was 4, Lula Mae relocated the family to Detroit in search of something better. What she found was a 2-room apartment in one of the city's most unforgiving neighborhoods, where the walls were thin, the winters were merciless, and dignity was something you fought for every single day. There was almost nothing. And yet inside that almost nothing, something extraordinary was already stirring. From the very beginning, Stevie heard the world differently. Every sound carried texture, weight, meaning. The creak of floorboards. The distant wail of a saxophone from a neighbor's radio. The hum his mother carried through the kitchen while she worked. He was absorbing everything, building a world entirely from sound. Long before anyone had a name for what he was doing, he was becoming the thing that would define not just his own life, but the emotional lives of hundreds of millions of people who had not yet been born. He was signed to Motown Records at the age of 11 years old. The label called him Little Stevie Wonder, a marketing decision that contained within it the entire architecture of exploitation that would take him a decade to escape. He recorded, performed, toured. He generated millions for a corporation that managed his money through a trust he could not access and could not audit. He was a child, and the adults around him were making decisions that served their interests and called it opportunity. In 1971, Stevie Wonder turned 21. And with that birthday came a reckoning the music industry had not anticipated. His child performer contract expired. The trust was finally his. And what he found, with the help of lawyers he had chosen himself for the first time in his life, was a truth as cold as a Detroit winter. The fortune that should have been waiting was a fraction of what it should have been. A child who had generated millions had reached adulthood with far less than the world imagined. He walked away from Motown, not in anger, but in something more deliberate and more dangerous. Silence. For months, one of the most successful artists in the label's history simply stopped. No recordings, no performances, no negotiations on their terms. Berry Gordy now faced the real possibility that Stevie Wonder at 21 was prepared to walk out the door and never come back. But Stevie did not want simply more money. He wanted something far more radical for a black artist in the early 1970s. Complete creative control. The right to write his own music, to produce his own albums, to own his masters, to be, in every sense, the author of his own artistic life. Motown resisted. The label had been built on a system of control, a production line of polished sound. But Stevie Wonder did not blink, and eventually Gordy yielded. In 1972, Stevie signed a new contract unprecedented in its terms. Complete creative control, improved royalties, the right to own his publishing through his own company, Black Bull Music. It was not simply a record deal. It was a declaration of artistic independence that reshaped what was possible for musicians, particularly black musicians, in the American recording industry. What followed was astonishing. Between 1972 and 1976, Stevie Wonder released 5 albums, now universally regarded among the greatest bodies of work in the history of popular music. Music of My Mind, Talking Book, Inner Visions, Fulfillingness First Finale, and Songs in the Key of Life. He played nearly every instrument himself. He composed, he produced, he pushed the boundaries of what a soul record could contain, weaving jazz and funk and gospel and classical and African rhythms into something that had no predecessor and has had no true successor. But the triumph had cost him something no Grammy could replace. The years of fighting for control had hardened something in a man raised on gentleness and gospel. He had won, undeniably, magnificently. But victory in the music industry is never clean. And the scars of a childhood spent as someone else's asset do not dissolve in the glow of 5 masterpiece albums. They go underground. Quiet, patient, waiting. On August 6, 1973, Stevie Wonder was 23 years old and at the absolute peak of his creative powers. He was traveling by car through Surry County, North Carolina, en route to a concert in Durham. A logging truck traveling in the opposite direction lost a large piece of timber from its load. The log struck the windshield and ricocheted directly into his skull with a force so violent that those who witnessed the aftermath believed, with quiet and terrible certainty, that Stevie Wonder was dead. He was not dead, but for 4 days, he was somewhere the living could not reach. The coma was deep and unresponsive. Doctors spoke in careful, measured tones that concealed more than they revealed. Brain damage was a possibility they could not dismiss. The musical genius that had produced Talking Book and Inner Visions was suspended somewhere between this world and whatever lies beyond it. His mother, Lula Mae, sat beside his bed and sang gospel songs she had hummed in their small Detroit kitchen. She sang because it was the only language she trusted to reach him wherever he had gone. On the 4th day, a musician friend leaned close to Stevie's ear and began singing one of his own songs back to him. Higher Ground, a song about the soul's refusal to be extinguished. Stevie's fingers began to move. He was following the thread of his own music back to the surface like a diver ascending from impossible depth. He woke, and the world exhaled. But waking was only the beginning. The brain injury permanently altered his sense of smell, a loss that for a man whose entire relationship with the world was constructed through senses other than sight represented a specific and irreversible devastation. The headaches were relentless. The recovery was measured in months of painful, uncertain reconstruction. He did not return as the same man. Songs in the Key of Life, released in 1976, 3 years after he had lain comatose in a North Carolina hospital, is widely regarded as the greatest album ever recorded. Not simply one of the great soul records, the greatest. A double album of such staggering emotional range, musical complexity, and spiritual depth that it seemed made by someone who had briefly visited a place beyond human understanding and returned with the music they heard there. Because in a very real sense, that is exactly what had happened. The near-death experience made him not more cautious, but more urgent. More achingly aware that every moment of creation was a gift that could be revoked without warning. By the early 1980s, Stevie Wonder had achieved something beyond ordinary measurements of fame. He had become necessary. A figure so deeply embedded in the emotional architecture of an entire culture that his absence from any significant moment felt like a gap, where something essential should have been. He campaigned relentlessly for a federal holiday honoring Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., composing Happy Birthday as an explicit anthem for the cause, performing at rallies, lobbying senators personally, and collecting 6 million signatures on a petition. He refused to perform in states that opposed the holiday, a financial sacrifice made without hesitation or public complaint. In 1983, President Reagan signed the legislation. The victory belonged to countless people. But there was broad acknowledgement that Stevie Wonder's commitment had been among the forces that finally made it real. In 1985, he stood in a recording studio alongside the most famous musicians on the planet and recorded We Are the World. When his turn at the microphone came, the room shifted into something closer to reverence. The single raised over $60 million for famine relief and became the fastest-selling American pop single in history at that time. But behind all of this, behind the Grammy stages and the civil rights stages and the rally stages, behind the radiant smile that never failed to appear on cue, the private life was fracturing in ways the spotlights avoided. His first marriage to Syreeta Wright had ended after 2 years. He had children with multiple women across the years, relationships carrying the inevitable complexity of a man whose schedule belonged to the world. He loved his children with a depth no one who knew him doubted. But love cannot compensate for absence. And Stevie Wonder was absent in the specific way that men consumed by purpose since childhood are absent. Present in the room, but unreachable. He met Kai Millard Morris in the late 1990s. She was a fashion designer, quietly formidable, a woman who seemed to understand both the demands of his public life and the complexity of the private man beneath it. They married in 2001. 2 sons followed, Kyland and Mandla. For a period, it appeared that Stevie Wonder had finally found the domestic peace his extraordinary life had always worked against. In 2009, Kai filed for divorce. The phrase used was irreconcilable differences, chosen specifically because it forecloses further questioning while providing the appearance of transparency. What emerged in the years that followed was more specific and more painful. Claims about emotional unavailability, so profound it bordered on neglect. About a man so consumed by music and obligation that the people closest to him were left waiting in a silence, all the more painful for being the silence of a man famous for filling the world with sound. For a man who had written You Are the Sunshine of My Life, who had composed Isn't She Lovely as a direct expression of overwhelming love, who had spent 5 decades telling the world that love was the most powerful force in human experience. The contradiction was not simply painful, it was existential. And yet it is not a contradiction at all. It is the same man who felt love with extraordinary depth also failed, as human beings fail, to translate that feeling consistently into the sustained, patient, unglamorous daily practice that love in a marriage actually requires. Genius does not exempt anyone from human limitation. There are people whose presence is so fundamental, so woven into the fabric of who we are, that we do not fully understand the weight of what they carry for us until the moment they are gone. For Stevie Wonder, that person was Lula Mae Hardaway. She had been there from the very beginning. The young woman who sat beside an incubator in a Saginaw hospital and watched her premature son fight for breath, not yet knowing that the oxygen saving his life was stealing his sight. The woman who carried him home blind into a world with no guaranteed place for him and decided, with quiet, unshakable conviction, that her son would not be defined by what he could not see. She died in 2006, and the fixed point was gone. Those close to him described a man fundamentally altered. Not broken in the dramatic way that makes for compelling headlines, but altered in the quieter, more permanent way of someone from whom something irreplaceable has been removed. He spoke about her in interviews with a tenderness so unguarded it was almost difficult to witness. She was everything, he said simply. And in those 2 words lived a grief too large for more elaborate expression. Marvin Gaye, his friend and peer, had been killed in 1984. Michael Jackson, with whom he had shared decades of friendship, died in 2009, the same year his marriage was publicly collapsing. Two griefs arriving simultaneously, the public one and the private one. Prince, whose musical genius had existed in a similarly stratospheric altitude, died in 2016. Another peer. Another voice that had understood without requiring explanation the specific loneliness of being that gifted in a world not quite designed to accommodate that level of gift. Each loss was its own wound. And wounds accumulate. For years, those closest to Stevie had spoken carefully about his health. About a fatigue beyond ordinary exhaustion. About a pallor that makeup could conceal on stage, but that was visible in unguarded moments. About a slowing not of his mind, which remained as sharp and musically voracious as ever, but of his body, which was presenting a bill for decades of relentless demand. The kidneys were failing. It was not sudden catastrophe. It was the slow, grinding deterioration of organs under sustained stress, a process advancing for years before it reached the threshold of crisis. The dialysis that preceded the transplant was its own particular indignity for a man who had spent his life in motion. Dialysis requires stillness, schedule, submission. Sitting for hours while a machine does the work that organs are supposed to do on their own. For a man whose relationship with his body had always been defined by what it could produce. Dialysis was a confrontation with limitation, so stark it could not be minimized or transformed into metaphor. In 2019, at a performance in London, he told his audience directly. A kidney transplant was scheduled. He was stepping back. He needed time to heal. The announcement landed with the weight of news that confirms what fear had been quietly whispering. The audience responded not with ordinary applause, but with something closer to the sound a community makes when it realizes it has been taking something precious for granted. The transplant was successful. The recovery was long and conducted with the privacy of a man more practiced at being strong for others than allowing others to witness his vulnerability. Then the pandemic arrived with particular menace for those whose immune systems were compromised by transplant medications. He retreated, and the man who had spent 70 years filling the world with sound found himself in a silence more enforced than any since those 4 days of coma in a North Carolina hospital nearly 50 years before. When he re-emerged, the physical change was visible in a way that moved people. He was thinner, more deliberate in his movements. The rocking at the keyboard was gentler now, slower, as if the body had learned through the long education of illness and recovery a new relationship with the rhythm of its own existence. He had been speaking with growing directness about race in America, about the persistence of systemic inequality, about the documented reality of Black Americans being killed by those whose sworn purpose was to protect them. The tone had shifted. The patience that had made him palatable across racial and political lines was giving way to something rawer, more exhausted, more willing to name what it saw without softening the naming for the comfort of those who preferred their social commentary melodic and unthreatening. He announced his intention to relocate to Ghana, not as metaphor, not as rhetorical gesture, but as a genuine, considered intention rooted in a conclusion reached after 7 decades of living in a country he had loved publicly and served generously. Some heard it as the statement of a man who had earned the right to make whatever choice served his peace. Others heard it as abandonment. The criticism came from unexpected directions, including from within the communities that had always claimed him most proudly. He responded with the directness of a man who had exhausted the patience required to explain himself. He was not abandoning America. He was choosing himself, his health, the peace his compromised body genuinely required. The right, at 70 years old, after everything, to live the remainder of his life in a way that served his well-being rather than the expectations of a public that had been consuming him since he was 10 years old. At 75 years old, Stevie Wonder does not move through the world the way he once did. The man who once crossed continents between Monday and Friday has slowed, not stopped, slowed. And in the slowing, something has become visible that the velocity of his extraordinary life always obscured. The man himself. His children are the gravitational center of whatever remains of his daily life. 6 children across several relationships, each a different chapter of his complicated, generous, imperfect history of love. He speaks about his children now with a humility not always present in earlier decades. About the recitals missed. The ordinary evenings that accumulated into childhoods he was not fully present for. He cannot recover those years. But he is present now in a way those who know him describe with quiet emotion. More patient, more still, more willing to simply be there without needing the room to become a stage. The music continues. There are recordings in various states of completion in the private archive of a man who has never stopped creating because creation is as necessary as breathing. An album has been promised for years. He will finish it on no timeline but his own. For a man whose childhood earnings were managed by others, that freedom is not simply a contractual privilege. It is a kind of justice. His faith remains the architecture beneath everything. The gospel humming of Lula May in a Detroit kitchen was the first music he ever absorbed, and it never left. He speaks about it now without softening. He believes in the continuation of those he has loved and lost. In reunion. In the grace of a universe that took his sight before he could open his eyes and gave him in exchange the ability to hear everything. At 75, the rocking continues. Slower, gentler, but still present. The sound that began in a small Detroit apartment, found by a blind boy in the rhythm of ordinary life, is still sounding. And so we arrive at the truth that the applause always drowned out. The truth about the boy from Saginaw, who never saw a single day of the world, he spent his entire life illuminating. Stevie Wonder did not transcend his suffering. He carried it, every piece of it, the blindness and the poverty, the industry that consumed his childhood earnings, the marriage that collapsed under the weight of his absence, the mother whose voice was the first music and whose silence was the loudest loss, the kidney that failed, the friends who died too young, the country that celebrated him for decades and then questioned him when he chose himself. He carried all of it, and he kept playing. That is not a fairy tale. Fairy tales require the suffering to be resolved, the wound to heal cleanly. What Stevie Wonder's life offers is something harder and more honest. The image of a man marked by everything that happened to him, who created from those marks something so luminous that it has outlasted every darkness it was born inside of. He was not perfect. He was absent when presence was needed. He was consumed by a gift that did not leave room for the ordinary requirements of love. He was, in all the ways that matter most, entirely human. And that is precisely why his story matters. Not because he was superhuman, but because he was not. Because a blind boy born into poverty in 1950, robbed of sight by the very intervention that saved his life, somehow produced the most extraordinary body of work in the history of American music. Not despite his suffering. From it. Out of it. Because of it. The darkness was not the obstacle to the light. The darkness was the condition in which the light became necessary. At 75, he is not the figure nostalgia requires. He is a man tired in some ways, marked by illness, choosing rest, choosing his children, choosing himself. And in choosing himself, he is doing something the symbol could never do, but that the man has earned completely. He is living. Not performing living for public consumption. Actually privately, imperfectly, preciously living. The world gave Stevie Wonder its highest honors, and he received them with the grace of a man who understood what they represented and the humility of a man who knew what they could not see. What they could not see was the cost. The years of dialysis. The marriages that failed. The children who needed more than fame could give. The mother whose absence left a silence no music could fill. The friends lowered into earth one by one. He once said that music is a world within itself, with a language we all understand. He was talking about what music does for listeners, but he was also describing what music had done for him. Given him a world within the world. A place where blindness was irrelevant and losses could be, for the duration of a song, transformed into something that made other people feel less alone. He gave us that world for 75 years. Every note a gift. Every album a piece of a life offered openly to strangers who needed it more than they knew. What we owe Stevie Wonder is the willingness to see him whole. The man and the music together. The triumph and the tragedy together. The light and the darkness together. Because one without the other is not truth. It is comfort dressed as tribute. He was born unable to see. And he spent 75 years teaching the rest of us how. If his music has ever reached something inside you that words alone could not find, leave a like. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe, because the stories that matter most are rarely the ones easiest to tell. And the next time you hear the opening notes of Superstition, or the quiet grace of you, or the sunshine of my life, or the devastating beauty of Az, remember what it cost him to make it. Remember the boy in the incubator, the poverty, the coma, the divorce, the dialysis chair, the mother's grave, the friends gone silent one by one. Remember all of it, and then let the music play, because it was made for exactly this moment. For when the weight of being human feels too heavy to carry alone. For when we need to be reminded by someone who had every reason to know otherwise and chose to believe it anyway that life, in all its cruelty and all its beauty, is, as Stevie Wonder has always insisted with every note he has ever played, worth singing about.